Hi everyone, it's the third Sunday of Advent and I'm going to share a scripture reflection looking at the readings that are being suggested for this Sunday. The first reading is from the Jewish scripture, Isaiah chapter 12, verse 1 to 6, and the gospel reading is from Luke 3, 7 to 18. But you might as well just read from the start. That's the reading that we had last week and it continues on. So last week we were hearing a bit about a man called John who was out in the desert, and he'd learned how to live out in the wild. He'd learned about wild bees so that he could harvest their honey to eat. If you watch bees and pay attention to them, you can learn to recognize their behavior and their mood. And if you're calm and relaxed and paying attention to the bees, they'll let you harvest their honey from the hive. The hive's a big nest that the bees build from wax that they produce from their own bodies. And it holds the honey and the baby bees, and at the center it holds the mother of all the bees, the queen. And all the bees in the hive serve the queen. Now, one of the things that John would learn when he's out in the desert harvesting honey is that the hive of the bees has the same temperature as a human body. The bees keep it at that warm temperature by vibrating their bodies to make heat. And that keeps the whole hive warm for the queen and for the baby bees. It's almost like the hive is a body and the bees are the hive's spirit or breath, keeping it alive and warm, coming and going like the coming and going of the breath in our bodies. Another thing that he learned about was locusts. Locusts are like grasshoppers. But one of the strange things about them is that they hear through the sides of their bodies. Another strange thing about them is that when they sing, they're rubbing their legs against their wings to make the noise. It's a strange way to sing. Normally, they live on their own out in the desert, and they have pretty dull colors so that they can blend in with the sand and the stones and things like that. But if there's a lot of food around, they start to change. They start to have lots of babies, and these new babies are bright in color, and they form enormous swarms that fly out of the desert until they find somewhere to land. And when they land, they eat all the plants they can find. You'd better hope that they don't land near you. Luckily, John has been out in the desert eating locusts, doing his bit to keep the numbers down. He eats them so that they don't eat everybody else's fruit and veggies. And while he is out in the desert, John learned a lot about snakes. Snakes are very strange because they have no legs, but they can move really fast. They can move across the ground or disappear beneath the ground, or they can climb trees. It seems as though they can go anywhere. It's like they can move between the underworld and the world of the living and the heavens. And their poison's very dangerous, but it can also be used to cure a snake bite. And lastly, they seem to have the ability to renew themselves. As they grow, they shed their old skins, and there's a shiny new skin underneath. We were hearing last week about how John was calling people to prepare for the arrival of Jesus and calling them to prepare for the kind of world that God's creating, and he's calling them to be washed in the river, to say that they were washing away the old ways that they used to live and coming out of the river clean and glistening like a new person, or like a snake who's just dropped their old skin. And in today's gospel reading, it sounds like John has the snakes in mind because he calls the people who are coming to him snakes. And it doesn't sound like he admires the snakes. It's like he sees all of these people coming from the city to be washed, and looking like they've responded to his challenge. But it's like he's saying it's not enough for them just to wash in the river and come out looking shiny and new like a snake with a new skin. They actually need to change their direction, not just look like they've changed. They have to be kind and generous to others, especially if they have power over other people. In that case, they need to make sure they're being fair and honest. And if you think about the people who have power over us in our society, we want them to be fair and honest. It's a problem when they're not. Leaders being fair and honest is going to be good news for us. When we were hearing last week about John calling people to change direction and telling people to make a straight path. It was making me think about the disruptions that we've had in the part of town where I live and where I minister in the southeast because of the suburban train loop that's being built. It means that it can be a bit difficult to get around at the moment, but it's part of a process of making the way straight. It'll mean that it's really easy for people to get to Clayton directly on the train. And it'll be really easy to travel directly on the train from Clayton to places like Box Hill or Glen Waverley. And it'll mean that if something happens on the Cranbourne-Pakenham line, as it often does, and if the train line is down and you need to get into the city, or if you need to get over to the west or the north, you'd be able to get on the loop and use the Belgrave-Lilydale line to get into the city instead. But at the moment, it can be frustrating having to find ways around construction sites and roadworks. It might not feel like the ways being made straight. When John's talking about straightening the roads and changing direction, he's talking about the ways that we live our lives. And it makes me think about my own discipleship and the things that I've found difficult. I have to say that the things that were difficult when I was a child and a teenager are still difficult in my 40s. I've often felt like I should have the will to change. I should be able to straighten those roads and follow Jesus in the way that he's taught us. When we hear John calling the crowd a brood of vipers, we might feel shame that we've been able to change our appearance like a snake does, but we haven't really been able to change our direction. We haven't been able to straighten our path. We keep winding along like snakes. It could be easy to be discouraged, especially when we hear John talking about chopping down a tree or burning the chaff or talking about God finding new children for Abraham. We should keep in mind that the gospel writer is saying that John is preaching the good news. Whatever he means, it should be something that brings joy to us. And based on what John says, I don't think we need to see ourselves as individual trees that are going to be chopped. And I say that because that's not what he says to the people when he addresses them. When people ask what they should do, he doesn't say, sorry, you're going to be chopped. He tells them to share what they have. And to people who have power over others, like tax officials and soldiers, he could have said, no, it's no chance for you, you're going to be burned up. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say that they're going to be destroyed because of the way that they've treated others, because they've made other people's lives miserable. He tells them to change their behavior, to use their power fairly. That might be hard since they're part of a world where people use whatever power they have to their advantage. If our leaders make that change, the good news is that they're forgiven for their sins, but also the good news is that others are not hurt by their bad behavior. We don't need to worry about their bad behavior if they change their behavior. It's the bad behavior that's chopped. It's the bad behavior that's being burned away. As I was saying, changing our behavior is not that simple. It can be really hard. That's why I've been encouraged by this week's reading from the Jewish scripture. In the earlier chapters of Isaiah, God has been criticizing the kingdom of Judah, who are the ancestors of the Jewish people. He's been criticizing them for their behavior. God has been very angry with them because of what they've been doing. But in the part that we read today, it talks about God's anger turning into something else. God is turning to comfort them. God forgives them and comforts them, like a parent comforting their child after a conflict. Something that Christians have often said is that the idea of a forgiving God begins with Christ. But here we can see that that's not true. The Jewish people knew of God's forgiveness hundreds of years before Christ. The witness here is that when conflict arises, God is willing to express anger, but ultimately wants to reconcile and comfort us. The arrival of Jesus and his death and resurrection are signs that God forgives us, but God's forgiveness is not new. This is a continuation of something that Jewish people already knew about God before the beginning of Christianity. It's just a continuation of that theme. I was saying earlier that I've had an impression that it was up to me to change myself through my own strength and through my own will, through my own mind power. But that often I've found that I continue to struggle with the same things that were hard when I started out as a Christian. In more recent years, I've been challenged instead to stop trying to fix myself, to instead allow myself to be embraced by God, who wants to forgive me and comfort me like a mum or a dad comforting their child. I've found that in this change of posture, I've been able to instead allow God to care for me and to gradually change me, gradually and patiently changing my direction and straightening my path in a way that I wasn't able to do in my own capacity.